Welcome back to the programme. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt, a contributing editor at the European Conservative magazine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the regular contributor to Courage Media, and our special guest this week, John Gillam, host of the Thinking Class podcast that has hosted guests as various as me and Connor Tomlinson. As well as, we should say, Peter Hitchens, David Starkey, and the philosopher Carl Trueman, along with a motley crew of others, well worth your time. John, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on your programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
So on your podcast, John, you make a point, and I think it's a very, very good one, of bridging the gap that often exists between younger and older conservatives. And it's interesting that you do that because there was a poll that came out recently showing that 52% of youngsters have no real time for democracy, viewing it as an inherently flawed system, whereas, of course, older generations, the boomer cons, are liable to see democracy as a noble ideal from which we've strayed, or something that is good in theory but may have failed in certain ways in practice. Are you alarmed or are you encouraged by these sorts of findings?
Well, as a true fence-sitter, I'm not able to fall back on any one point, but I would say that it's unsurprising. And I wonder if it's because they're not necessarily railing against democracy, because the democracy that they're railing against is somewhat of a charade at this point. And I say that as someone who's found himself through a long, circuitous route towards the professional managerial class, and a pretty non-standard one, to find myself where special interest groups are set up quite regularly amongst people who have particular special interests, whether it's on climate, whether it's on social issues, and they're also heavily funded. I would say that from my time in working my way through maturity is that whatever it is that we think is democracy is not delivering is likely because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes, which sounds very shadowy and puppet master, but in reality we are governed by NGOs, activist networks, big billionaire philanthropists, and primarily people are probably feeling fairly cut off from the day-to-day.
From your anecdotal contact with the professional managerial class, which of course in our under our system tends to lean to the left rather than to the right, do you think that these people are equally dissatisfied with democracy? I mean, of course, they probably view it in a different way to how we view it. Usually, and I think it's quite a useful shorthand. Usually when you see places like the Washington Post or the New York Times, or indeed in our country, Sky News, or saying our democracy, they really mean our managerial bureaucracy. They don't really mean democracy in the sense that it's a 19th century or early 20th century theorist of democracy as kind of people power, setting the people free, understood it. But the people in the professional managerial classes who presumably you interact with, I think you might be the first member of this class to have appeared on the programme. Do you think that they are equally dissatisfied with democracy, or they just like what they think of as democracy, which isn't democracy?
I think that what we've got going on here is a few things. We've got people who are absolutely convinced that they are global citizens. Typically, they embody Kant's universal values, are things that you can reason, pull out of the sky, and everyone can have them. They transcend all vestiges of history in whatever historical context you've grown up in. And there's a real frustration when people outside of the bubble don't find themselves thinking the same thing. And as far as I can tell, there are people who promote the activist networks insofar as they believe that there's a real truth there. And they do see the links to whether it's national character, whether it's national history, to be somewhat intrusive to the idea of globalized business where we all rub along. And indeed, kind of does happen up at that level. And I think Mary Harrington's talked about it, where cosmopolitanism, heavily gate-kept, can actually work. And you can have people of all different stripes and backgrounds rubbing along with one another. But in reality, all of us are entombed in our little air-conditioned buildings, looking at spreadsheets, following metrics and targets, coming up with our big goals, And things like Brexit, Trump, anything which is a shot across those bows is seen as a threat. So yeah, I think there probably is a distaste for democracy when there are those less enlightened folk who are taking part in it.
Yeah, I think before Connor comes in, I think that a useful shorthand way for thinking about this would be that whereas what we might call, for want of a better word, the enthusiastic, exuberant Zoomer right, they actually do quite like democracy in theory, even if they might say that they don't, because they associate democracy with politics proper. In other words, like politics is a field in which competition takes place. The essence of politics is decision making, and sooner or later a decision about certain contentious matters that foist themselves upon us are going to be made. And so their beef with our democratic system is that, as you say, it tries to bring politics to an end, and they actually think that we need some politics. Whereas I suppose in the professional managerial class, they associate democracy with politics having been brought to an end, and so it can be purely the preserve of the professional managerial types like them. So there are all sorts of ambiguities going on here. Connor, would you like to?
Well, yeah, this is best summed up in the title of Professionally Useless People of the Professional Managerial Class, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell's podcast, The Rest is Politics, presuming that everything is a settled science, and then afterwards we're just going to debate about marginal tax rates. And so they show real annoyance when disruptions to their worldview make themselves evident. For example, Rory Stewart's catastrophic prediction that Kamala Harris is going to sweep across the board and get the popular vote, when the cackling hag was the absolute worst candidate to put up against President Trump, and thank God he got a second term. What I find quite interesting is when you bring up Mary Harrington's idea of essentially the airport lounge. It's the only place where this kind of stage-managed global liberal democracy can work. It's because it's surveilled at all times by a panopticon airport security apparatus that makes everyone play nice. So either liberal democracy can work very well among a homogeneous cultural, ethnic, geographic group, sort of democracy for 130 IQ Anglos, as it were, or it works very well among the international rootless business class, heavily managed by men with guns. Otherwise, if you keep adding different food groups and indigestible tribal diasporas to our democracy, as it does, things end up getting to the place where the most illiberal element takes the strongest say, which is the sort of very aggressive, tribalistic, race communist activist groups, or the Home Office Islamic Network, who have decided to set all of the counter-terror priorities because they are very self-conscious about the global goals of the Ummah. And I think this happens because that exact professional managerial class think that democracy is the means by which everyone's self-evident self-interest is realized. They don't really care about one man, one vote. They think that because everyone's exactly the same deep down, they can appoint their independent experts to administer things via quango or committee. And so they can make decisions on your behalf, and you would vote for it because it's in your self-interest anyway, if only you weren't lied to by these divisive racist populists like Donald Trump, which is why we can silence them and shut them up and redo Brexit until we get the result we want. So I'll put a question to that. Do you think this sort of universal, fungible anthropology of the human that is the same absolutely anywhere is the reason why the professional managerial class have this view of democracy?
I think partly, yes. I also think that we are seeing the end point, very Patrick Deneen style of liberalism, which is this desire to free us all, make us all autonomous individuals, of which the PMC, professional managerial class, think they are the embodiment of, and that everyone is able to be that. We're all perfectly wise, perfectly rational beings, and we can transcend all of the things that once tied us. Obviously doesn't apply to a lot of people who see that they don't feel that. But this Deneen endpoint of liberalism, I think what we're seeing is perhaps a response to the democracy not working, and thus let's get a dictator in, because what we're looking around at is we've got lots of freed, autonomous individuals floating around, those who've ultimately got no real national history to look back on and allowed to, no national culture that they can feel connected to. And so we've talked about this before, the rapid consumer culture, just click and buy, that's your life. But on the flip side, we've also got what Keir Starmer refers to as the communities. And this is not exactly like the liberal unity of the past, where you had at least one nation. Indeed, there might be some warring factions within that, but usually within the same tradition, or at least same common cultural references. And now what we're seeing is a disparate group of tribes, both ideological and otherwise, that can no longer agree on the basics, and a state which has to continually clamp down to try and maintain a peace and an order. Bit of a roundabout way of answering your question. Ended up shoehorning in quite a bit of the other people outside of the PMC, but I think that's how they interact.
Well, I think that's perfect. I mean, Keir Starmer fits this mould because he once said he prefers living in Davos to governing in Westminster, for example. And I also think it's very telling, so by the time this is out, this will be a couple of weeks ago, but there was the leaked Raiku report that has been out today. I've reported on the initial leaks back in November 2024, but it came out in January 2025, where they dismissed the grooming gangs as a grievance narrative, and they said that claims of two-tier policing are a far-right extremist dog whistle. But the very telling reason they said these things is because they said that these narratives present a barrier to integration. So because they are disharmonious, because these far-right racists noticing the problem are stopping everyone from holding hands and singing Kumbaya, we must crack down on the far-right racists rather than the communities who we have to constantly appease.
It goes to show how they have a very narrow view of culture as well. You're absolutely right. They have this sort of the kind of grotesque manner in which they exculpate themselves. It's truly horrifying. I mean, clearly, this is downstream of our experiment with mass immigration and diversity, and yet rather than blaming the problem itself or the long-standing political elite that has caused the problem, they blame the people who are pointing out the problem and present them as the sort of counter-entropic force to assimilation and integration. So it is insane, but I do think I think you're right, it stems from either a very anti-cultural view of the world, which is a term that's coined by Patrick Deneen as well in his book Why Liberalism Failed, in the sense that culture doesn't really matter, it doesn't really cut very deep. We are fundamentally just sort of universal human beings at large, and culture is sort of whatever we graft onto that, and if it's grafted on to us, it can be grafted off if need be, in the interests of harmony, in the interests of political order, in the interests of liberation and all the rest of it. Or if they don't have a completely wholesale anti-cultural view of the human person. We should say as well, another reason why it works in airports is that you could not imagine a more anti-cultural place than an airport itself. I imagine if airports were viewed as states, and even if these people were sort of the high IQ, C-suite business class, there probably would be, and then get rid of the men with guns as well. I imagine these would be highly contentious places, because I'm sure all sorts of ethnic squabbles would develop very, very quickly, but because people use airports as a kind of medium between countries rather than seeing them as countries themselves, they are just these kind of anti-cultural economic zones fit only really for consumerism. That's another reason why it works very well. Or if they don't have a completely wholesale anti-cultural view of the human person, which sort of writes off culture altogether, they view culture as a kind of decorative irrelevance, which is why you have this idea of... This is what Roy Jenkins... I spoke a little bit about this when I came onto your show. The arch multiculturalist in this country was Roy Jenkins, who sort of has, on one level, has quite a realistic view of human beings, because he understands that people are going to cleave to their culture. And so when he was in favor of mass immigration into this country, he said, it's not going to be a problem because people can cultivate their own culture in the home, but in the public sphere, they can be sort of upstanding citizens of a multicultural republic, and everyone can follow the law, and you get all of a sudden this idealism creeps in. So he's very realistic about the privacy of the home, but very unrealistic about, actually, culture isn't just a decoration, it's something that infuses the human person on every possible level. And as Connor says, it's the people who are going to have the most illiberal, intolerant cultures who are going to make those preferences. No. Do you think that another byproduct of our experience with diversity and multiculturalism is that distinction, which used to make sense when we were a more homogeneous society between the public and the private, is breaking down? And Zoomers, I suppose, are sort of noticing this in a way that boomers, frankly, not all of them, some I assume are good people, and some of them I'm sure are watching the show, hello. But a lot of them sort of, when they still live in the very settled parts of Britain, and they still kind of view the public-private distinction as carrying a legitimacy.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the split on the Zoomers who'd responded to this as to the worldviews and, I suppose, sub-communities that they're part of. So we've talked about those who might be part of the professional managerial class. So your typical graduates finding themselves working around the big corporates, they're going to have very much that universalist view we've been talking about. You've got the crowd, which are typically cynical about Western civilization. I've also been part of that in my past. And these two groups, what distinguishes from the third group, I think, is that they're both, I think Christopher Lasch says, they're the heir to all the ages, and yet they're unconscious of their debts to the past. Both of them are quite anti-historical. But this third group, which I think is probably best represented at the moment by someone like Charlie Downs, is that they are very much aware of their past. They really do have a sense of national belonging, or at least they're seeking to rescue it. And so I suppose the answer to your question is, who's noticing that breakdown between public and private? I think it depends where you stand. If you're part of the PMC, you're probably looking around, scratching your head, going, "What on earth is going on here?" If you're part of the crowd that's going to carry every flag but the national flag and go to rallies every week and rail against it, you're probably going to go, "Yeah, well, the public and private's breaking down because we've got this tyranny up here that is the establishment that we all need to bring down." And then you've got the other crowd, which I think they're probably noticing the breakdown of public and private a lot. And I wonder if they are finding themselves in those places that you talked about. You know, the difference between boomers might be they find themselves living in the places less impacted by these political policies.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to see whether those 52% who are saying in favour of the dictatorship because they're seeing the social enemy in whichever way they view it, is because they find themselves surrounded by it. Whereas for me, I grew up in a abbey town in Northumberland, 12,000 people. I was a child of the boomer revolution, as it were, totally nihilistic and cynical about everything, didn't see any benefits to where I was from. And yet I would say that a lot of people who are coming through their early years are probably of that mold. They think that the establishment is the aristocracy, but that's long gone. Whereas I suppose the Zoomers like Charlie saying, well, no, the establishment is this NGO private institution network that's pushing things along to their own benefit.
Not men in bowler hats anymore.
Can I say there's a fourth group here that hasn't been addressed?
Okay.
Zoomers are a particularly diverse diaspora. So when we went to school, for example, there were different ethnic and religious groups, and we probably got on independently with kids. Like, I remember plenty of the Nigerian kids I'd laugh and joke with, especially when I was terrible in PE lessons and they'd take the piss out of me. Lovely guys. But when you go to the lunch tables, they would sit in their different demographic groups. They would make cultural in-jokes, and there would be not necessarily hostility, but a kind of apathy about intermingling. It was not a multicultural dream. It was very siloed ethnic nations within nations, as you were saying. So how much of this phenomena, where 52% of Gen Z in the brand new polling have an affinity for a strong man who can circumvent parliamentary elections and take charge, about 30, that was the actual phrasing.
But I think I know where you're going.
About 33% of them said, stick the army in charge. Quite a few of them thought AI governance was good. And 47% said we need a revolutionary reconstitution of how we do everything in the country. How much of this are thinking intifada? How much of this are thinking caliphate? Because the average age of Muslims in this country, and they have more children, it's a lot younger than the average age of the native British demographic. So how much of this are members of the community who are thinking, yeah, I would quite like to actually have a larger anti-democratic presence? And then the inverse of that, okay, if we're going to put a lot of premium on lived experience, as you said, you grew up in the nihilistic but very cozy twilight of the boomer revolution.
Yeah.
Our lived experience is very much that we went to diverse schools, but it's also that what is the most salient political issue, or political moment rather, for the Zoomers? For millennials it was 9/11, for the Zoomers it was COVID. And so that showed that for 2 years the government could put you under effective house arrest. Okay, so the public-private distinction was entirely erased overnight by a press conference given by Boris Johnson on television. And so if the government can do literally everything at the drop of a hat, then the incompetence of the government is no longer in dispute. It's just the malice of whoever's controlling the government at the time and currently making those straight white men who are very competent, law-abiding, like myself, Harrison, and Charlie Downs, public enemy number one. Okay, well, if the government can do all that against my interests, why don't we put someone in who can do things for my interest? Now, I'm not necessarily agreeing with this. I'm making the steel man as a case. But how much is caliphate and how much is, well, you did it during COVID, why not do it for me?
Great question. Does the data go that far?
They didn't provide a breakdown, which is frustrating. I mean, it was for true before, so what did we expect?
It would be interesting to see, though, wouldn't it? Because, there's no guarantee in advance what the ideological complexion of this, and I don't use...
Strongman.
Yeah, I don't use the word complexion like that, but it's not obvious what the what kind of character that's going to take on. I do think that another puzzling... I think are you a millennial, John?
I am a millennial.
Yeah, I'm very puzzled by your generation, I must say. I don't quite understand it because they are collectively. You are so much worse than ours. Collectively, somehow I seem good people again. So what stake do you think millennials feel they have in this system, which they seem to defend pretty assiduously? I would say, despite the fact that in a very tangible way, it's costs for them in terms of economics. Affording a house, that sort of thing, in terms of culture, in terms of demographics, have been totally disastrous. I mean, I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who is himself millennial, and he was talking about how he had recently had a conversation with this perfectly nice sort of normie millennial girl and he was trying to red pill her a little bit on the grooming gangs and trying to red pill her a little bit on Southport and all this sort of thing, and she was just completely blind to any of this evidence, despite the fact that she pays an extortionate rent in London. She's basically been priced out of having any kind of decent standard of living in her own capital city. She hasn't been able to raise a family. And meanwhile, we've got all sorts of immigrants who are sort of, dutifully given social housing upon arrival. Every single fibre of self-interest in her body should be motivating her to become as radical as some Zoomers are, and yet the millennials at scale don't seem ever to have done that. What do you think is unique about your generation in that respect, despite the honourable exceptions?
I'd love to know, and I'd love to know because of my own personal experience with having conversations about this kind of stuff, which usually I haven't driven, largely because dinner table etiquette suggests you shouldn't just start careering in with the big topics of the day, particularly when you know that there's a good chance that whatever it is you say might well get mischaracterized. However, I have had a few instances in and around my social group that really want to know how I got from A to B with regards to my political views. They know that at one point I had effectively been with them, right? The universalist view, the view of left liberal progressivism. And I realize that there's almost nothing I can say through my experiences that will convince them otherwise. To them, I'm, as you've referred to already, beyond the pale.
You're a class traitor.
A class traitor, yes. But what I find quite interesting is I think people will have you as an oddity. They want to know how you got from A to B. And you've pointed out all of these various bits of evidence which you can feel if you're walking around, depending on what lives you're living. And I suppose my question, if I was ever able to get a word in to be able to put it back to them, would be, well, how are you still at A? It's not. We're not asking you to sign up to anything here, but ultimately, as you've mentioned, there's a whole lot of evidence that suggests that things are not going particularly well with our political engineering, and clearly it has had downstream consequences for us. But I don't see too much of a shift amongst my generation, and in many respects, this is the biggest way I could possibly expose myself. I think people always had a bit of a suspicion that I might have disavowed myself of the same views, but I don't really know how and why the millennials are the way they are.
So on that, I do have a theory as to why the millennials and Gen Z might be going in different political directions. You've already mentioned Mary Harrington. She has asserted that generations are a very 20th century thing. We speak about the baby boomers because they were the largest cohort repopulating the country following a generation of young men dying in the Second World War, which, depends on who you ask. But if you ask the Labour Party these days on Holocaust Memorial Day that just passed, because they're beholden to the community, it was people dying because they just wanted to live as they were. We're not going to talk about particularly who died and for what. But anyway, point being, the baby boomers were largest generation, and then Gen X came after the baby boomers adopted the birth control pills, so they were adapting to that technological change. The millennials were the generation that were introduced to the internet, and Gen Z were the ones adapting to the proliferation of the internet, the culture. There's very self-selective cultures on the internet. I think it's the millennials' frame of reference is a lot more narrowly controlled by the cultural products at the time. They all listen to the same music, they watch the same TV shows or rallied against the same TV shows. Like Fox News lives very large in the millennial mind as the sort of arbiter of the pro-war, post-9/11 neocon worldview, and Green Day and Rage Against the Machine represent very much the opposite of that. Whereas the Zoomers can find their own little satellite communities on the internet, first sort of interest-based, whether it's hobbies or media, and then those various sub-communities code left or right-wing, which then confers social capital, different social capital blocks, on either the left or right-wing. We saw this recently with Trump's victory. It wasn't a large cohort of millennials that were partying. The Gen Xers largely voted for Trump, but it was the Zoomers who were having all of the inauguration parties. This is why that dreadful New York Magazine piece said that they were the cruel kids table. If they wanted to make them look evil, they could have used a less attractive and flattering photo on the front cover, especially when it was written by a freakish-looking transsexual. But point being, I think it's because there are parallel social capital bases, which allow you to feel comfortable expressing right-wing opinions, and the right-wing opinions are just what you notice with the filters off. Otherwise, you lose too much social capital if you say, yeah, I've turned my social approval filters off, and I do actually just notice the problems before my own eyes.
It's funny, in a way, sort of millennials like Mark Zuckerberg came along and said, I want you to curate your own internet experience. And the Zoomers went, yes, okay, I will. and maybe, well, obviously Mark Zuckerberg has come aboard now, but...
With a Zoomer haircut.
With a Zoomer haircut. So, yeah, with a sort of, what do you call it? Like the broccoli haircut. Yeah. Go on, John. You want to say something?
I was going to talk about looking at evidence in the eye and not changing your mind on it. And I'll share a very brief nutshell of my arc. I'm not a man of nutshells, but I'm under time pressure, so I'll try. So I was an early school leaver, didn't go to university, so I wasn't shaped by that being away from home, liberal metropolitan crowd. And I spent 7 years retail and sales, door-to-door sales, call center sales, all sorts of things. And then I found myself on the way to the professional managerial class, having gotten a job in a former mining town of Northumberland. It was a bank. The only people who had money were people who had been paid out from mines. By this point, I'd had a few years where I bounced between the Northeast and the Northwest, and I'd been introduced to someone who was a big Che Guevara fan. So I was learning lots of Chomsky and Guevara, and then I became a militant atheist as well at the same time. And I found myself, as I started to rub shoulders with the PMC, as it were, moved off to a head office in Leeds, started rubbing shoulders with people who were my peer group, but they'd been through that formative experience, that I was almost trying to keep up with them. Looking back, I'd engaged in preference falsification in some way, where I thought, well, this is what you do. And so I remember being absolutely aghast at Brexit and everything it represented, because all I read was The Guardian. But interestingly, the person that introduced me to one of the first bits of evidence that started to have things collapse a bit was Sam Harris. Of all people, Sam Harris, he had Douglas Murray on. First time I'd heard of Douglas Murray. And it was at this point that I learned of the extent of Rotherham, Telford, Newcastle, Oxford. And it was then that I realised, having a few months before been effectively a fan of St. Pauli, the German football team, because they held refugees welcome signs up, that I realised, actually, just having open borders might not be a great idea. This doesn't feel so good. And in fact, my time in Germany, which I did as I was transitioning through the professional managerial class, as it were, I was about to move to London from Leeds. I thought, I'm going to go and live in Germany. I'd been learning the language in the evenings. I thought, I can be German. Britain's for the birds. It's totally on the way out. I'm going to go and be German, because I thought of Berlin and being hyper-progressive. And off I went to live there. And again, bizarrely enough, a left-of-centre intellectual introduced me to the concept of patriotism and why it's important and why you should have some kind of gratitude to the country that you're from.
Who was that?
Michael Sandor.
Yeah.
And so it was these moments, things started to fall apart in front of me. And then one of the final nails in the coffin that summer was I was about to leave Berlin. I'd had a few months there. My dad and my brother had come to visit me on the last weekend. My brother had been given a Rolex from my dad, which my dad had worked very hard for, and gifted it to him. And Dad decided to go back to the hotel, and off we went for a walk and a couple of beers. Anyway, he ended up being robbed by presumably a Syrian asylum seeker home to our exchange on the street, and off goes the Rolex. And then I found myself a little bit later on that summer surrounded by people at this anti-corruption summit, which I'd gone to for a week. And as you can imagine, that was full of the kind of ideas which I was now struggling with. And all of a sudden, all of these ideas were swirling around, and I heard all of these assertions, and I realised that actually, no, what you say in Brexit isn't the case, and no, all of these things which you think are liberal progressive bona fides that everyone should accept can't possibly be accepted when you've had these moments. And I suppose my final road to Damascus moment was later that summer. I was about to move to London, went and visited a friend who'd been travelling all over South America and went to Colombia. Last day there, he was in another city. I was waiting for my flight back, but I thought, I'll go up this mountain just out of the city centre, and off I went. Turns out that there was a coordinated robbery of me at knife point. They just saw this big, tall guy and followed me through the neighbourhood as I thought it was a shortcut. And as that plane was coming into Heathrow, this is before I've had the experience of living in London, but people say that you view the world the way you were when you're 20, when you're 40. I wasn't 40 at that point, I was about 30. But I did, as we came under those clouds and I saw the green grass of England, I thought, I'm glad to be home, the country of law and order. And it was then that I realised that cultures aren't just values, summaries, bullet points, that there's something behind it, and boy, have I been pretty ungrateful. So yes, I suppose I had to remove those filters because experience, people say, conservatives are liberals mugged by reality, and that was me repeatedly that summer.
But have you considered said Syrian refugee might now go forth and set up a watch-selling business and contribute positively to the GDP? Therefore, we shouldn't bore him.
They need capital, John. They need capital. Yes. Well, I must say that your Thinking Class podcast, Colin and I both appeared on that. I watch it fairly regularly as well. It does model that sort of intellectual and experiential openness very well. So people should be sure to have a look at that. Very quickly before we finish up, what have you got in the pipeline at the moment, and where can people find your work?
So in the pipeline at the moment, I have a few guests coming on. I've got Nigel Bigger coming on. I've just recorded with David Starkey. James Orr is also coming on, and I believe your mutual friends, Charles Cornish-Dale, Raw Egg Nationalist too.
Great, yeah.
So that's going to be an interesting one, getting into the philosophy of food. What I'm working on, I suppose I'm starting to put pen to paper on a book, which ultimately is a bit of a comparative history of the elites post-war and the elites pre-war, which is, can we be sure that those stuffy old people that brought the world that we currently inhabit in were really as bad as they say they were? And what have we, and me now being part of the cultural elite, really got to say that we have bequeathed to the world? And a bit of an analysis of that. So it'll be self-published. I don't think a publisher will take a man who's effectively an anon, but that's what's coming. You can find my page, Thinking Class, John Gillam on YouTube, and all the good podcast platforms.
John, thank you for joining us. Connor, thank you very much. As ever, you've been watching the programme. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment. If you wish to do so, do check out John Gillam's Thinking Class podcast on YouTube, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.